November 3rd, 1974. Soviet submarine K-306 closes to 800 yards inside Holy Loch, Scotland. The sonar operator reports a faint blade rate on the contact they thought was moored. USS James Madison, 16 Poseidon nuclear warheads aboard, is maneuvering toward them at 4 knots. The Victor-class captain has 30 seconds to avoid collision in British territorial waters. He assumed Madison would stay tied alongside the tender based on a satellite photo 3 days old. Madison submerged 10 minutes ago, testing a new quiet propulsor. Passive sonar in this congested anchorage cannot distinguish a moving submarine from pier reflections and tidal noise. The captain orders emergency back full, but the reactor takes 15 seconds to reverse turbines and both boats are still closing. Earlier that day, K-306 holds station in international waters off Holy Loch, a major U.S. submarine refit base on the west coast of Scotland. The mission? Trail USS James Madison, ballistic missile submarine SSBN 627, and record its acoustic signature for Soviet targeting files. Captain's orders are passive sonar only. No active pings that would alert NATO patrols or the Royal Navy coastal defenses. Holy Loch hosts 1 to 3 missile boats at any time, moored alongside the tender USS Canopus. The Victor captain has outdated navigation charts and no real-time intelligence on U.S. departure schedules. Standard Soviet doctrine is to wait outside territorial waters, pick up the SSBN as it clears the Firth of Clyde, then follow at a safe distance into the North Atlantic. The K-306 sonar operator reports multiple submerged contacts inside Holy Loch. Echoes from moored tenders, the floating Drydock, pier pilings, and at least 2 submarines. Passive bearings overlap, ranges uncertain. There is no way to distinguish stationary hulls from maneuvering vessels in this acoustic clutter. The captain reviews the problem. If Madison departs submerged and reaches deep water before K-306 acquires it, the trail mission fails. Soviet doctrine assumes contact acquisition in open water at 5,000 yards or more. Inside a confined anchorage, that assumption breaks down. The captain decides to close the distance and penetrate British territorial waters to improve sonar geometry and ensure positive identification before Madison disappears. The captain orders course change to 045 degrees, speed 6 knots. K-306 crosses the territorial line. Standard Soviet procedure requires GRU intelligence confirmation of the target's departure time before penetration. The captain has no such confirmation. He is relying on a satellite photograph taken 3 days earlier showing Madison moored alongside Canopus. The plan is simple. Close to 500 yards abeam of the moored submarine, pick up Madison's screw noise as it casts off and exits the loch, then follow it into international waters. The risk is controlled, or so it seems. The constraint is time. If Madison has already departed, or if it departs while K-306 is inside the loch, the geometry collapses and the mission window closes. 10 minutes earlier, USS James Madison cast off from USS Canopus and submerged inside Holy Loch, an unusual procedure. Normally, ballistic missile submarines surface transit to the mouth of the Firth of Clyde before diving. Madison's captain elected to dive early to test a new quiet propulsor modification in shallow water before beginning the Atlantic patrol. That decision places Madison submerged and maneuvering at 4 knots inside the loch at the same moment K-306 closes on the datum where Madison was moored. Neither submarine knows the other is there. Madison's sonar detects faint machinery noise astern but classifies it as auxiliary traffic. K-306's sonar holds bearing 045, no Doppler shift measurable, contact still assumed stationary. Both boats are on converging courses. Passive sonar in Holy Loch detects 8 to 12 overlapping acoustic signatures. Tenders, the floating Drydock, moored ballistic missile submarines, active auxiliary vessels. No Doppler shift is measurable at ranges under 2,000 yards. Bearing drift, the rate a contact's compass direction changes, requires 3 minutes of stable tracking to compute. The Victor sonar operator has been tracking bearing 045 for 90 seconds. Drift is masked by pier reflections and tidal current noise washing over the hull. The contact appears stationary because its bearing is not changing fast enough to rise above the noise floor. In reality, a contact maneuvering at 4 knots and closing at an oblique angle produces only 1 to 2 degrees per minute of drift, below the system's short-term resolution. Soviet doctrine for ballistic missile submarine trailing assumes contact acquisition in open water at 5,000 yards or more. Doctrine also assumes the target is transiting at patrol speed, 8 to 12 knots, producing clear blade rate and Doppler. Inside a confined anchorage, those assumptions collapse. Range to contact shrinks faster than sonar can update bearing solutions. The K306 captain is following the doctrine he was trained on, but the environment does not match the training scenario. He expects Madison to be moored, then to cast off and accelerate toward the Firth of Clyde mouth. Instead, Madison is already submerged, already maneuvering, and already inside the engagement envelope. The doctrine has no procedure for this geometry. The K306 sonar operator reports one contact bearing 045 degrees relative. Classification uncertain. Assumed stationary. That assumption is based on position matching the last satellite photo of Madison moored alongside Canopus, taken 3 days earlier. Satellite reconnaissance has a revisit interval of 2 to 4 days over Holy Loch. The captain has no other source of real-time position data. The photo shows Madison tied outboard of another ballistic missile submarine, stern toward the lock entrance. The bearing 045 contact matches that datum. Therefore, the contact is Madison, and Madison is moored. The logic is sound, but the data is stale. Madison cast off 90 minutes after the photo was transmitted to K306. The captain does not know that. K306 maintains course and speed toward the assumed moored contact. The plan is to pass 500 yards abeam, then pick up Madison's screw noise as it exits the lock. No update from sonar because bearing drift is still masked by pier clutter and tidal current noise. Madison, meanwhile, is executing a slow turn to starboard to clear a moored auxiliary vessel. That turn places Madison on a course that intersects K306's track. Neither captain knows the other's position. Madison's sonar holds a faint contact astern, classified as harbor traffic. K306's sonar holds bearing 045, range estimated 1,200 yards based on signal strength, no change in classification. Both submarines are competently operated, both are following sound procedures, and both are blind to the convergence. At 1,200 yards, the K306 sonar operator reports a faint blade rate increase on bearing 045. Contact is maneuvering, not moored. Range now estimated 800 yards and closing. Bearing drift right, 2 degrees per minute. The operator calls out the update. The captain freezes for 2 seconds, processing the new information. If the contact is maneuvering, it is not Madison moored, it is Madison underway. Range and bearing geometry indicate closure. The captain orders all stop and emergency backing bell. The reactor takes 15 seconds to reverse steam flow to the turbines. The submarine continues forward on inertia at 6 knots. Distance to contact is now 600 yards, and the bearing drift is accelerating. At 200 yards, Madison sonar detects the Victor and calls out a submerged contact close aboard, bearing 020, range uncertain, but inside 500 yards. Madison's captain orders right full rudder to open the bearing and increase separation. The ballistic missile submarine's turning circle at 4 knots is roughly 300 yards diameter. K306 is still closing on inertia, now under emergency backing power, but forward speed only dropping to 4 knots. Both submarines are now turning. The turning circles overlap. Madison's sonar operator reports contact bearing is not opening. Contact is also turning. Collision is imminent. The captain sounds the collision alarm. Crew brace for impact. Contact. The Victor's reinforced bow strikes Madison's starboard side just aft of the sail at 3 knots relative closure speed. The impact rolls Madison 8 degrees to port. K306's bow sonar dome shears off. Madison's outer hull plating buckles across a 9-foot section, frames 47 to 56. The collision sounds through both hulls, a deep grinding scrape followed by a sharp metallic crack. Victor's crew are thrown forward in the torpedo room. Madison's crew in the missile compartment hear the impact and feel the roll. Both captains order damage reports. No immediate flooding reported on either boat, but pressure hull integrity is unknown until visual inspection topside. Both captains order emergency surfacing. There is no other choice. Madison's damage control officer reports impact noise in the missile compartment, frames 47 to 56. The pressure hull here is double-walled. The outer hull absorbs collision loads. The inner pressure hull is rated to 1,300 feet depth, but the missile tubes penetrate both hulls. Each Poseidon tube is 27 feet tall, welded to the pressure hull at the base, sealed at the top by a gas-tight hatch. Tube failure modes. A cracked weld admits seawater into the space between outer and pressure hull, or a cracked tube admits water directly into the missile compartment, flooding warhead guidance systems and risking a hydraulic detonator pressure spike. The damage officer checks internal pressure gauges on all 16 tubes. No pressure drop detected. Crew reports no water sound inside the compartment, but external hull damage is not visible from inside. A slow crack in a missile tube could take 30 minutes to show on internal pressure gauges. The only way to confirm hull integrity? Surface. Open the topside missile deck hatches and visually inspect the outer hull plating and tube alignment. But surfacing puts Madison on the surface inside British territorial waters with a Soviet submarine alongside. Any NATO patrol aircraft overhead will photograph a damaged Soviet nuclear submarine in British waters next to a US ballistic missile boat. That is a photo intelligence bonanza. It confirms the Soviet territorial violation and the espionage mission. Both governments will face immediate crisis. The Madison captain has no choice. He cannot dive with 16 warheads aboard until he knows the hull is intact. He orders emergency ballast blow. The Victor captain faces a parallel problem. The bow sonar dome is crushed, flooding likely in the sonar equipment space forward of the torpedo room. If flooding spreads aft into the torpedo room, loss of buoyancy forward will pitch the bow down and prevent depth control. The captain cannot dive deep or transit home until he assesses the damage. He must surface before the flooding spreads. Surfacing confirms his territorial violation. If NATO photographs the Victor on the surface inside Holy Loch, Moscow cannot deny the espionage mission. Diplomatic crisis is certain. But if he dies with uncontrolled flooding, the submarine may not survive the transit to international waters. The captain orders emergency ballast blow. He has no choice either. Both submarines execute emergency ballast blow. High-pressure air stored at 3,000 pounds per square inch forces water from the main ballast tanks. The submarine becomes buoyant and rises at 3 feet per second. Madison surfaces first, breaking the surface 6 minutes after the collision. Victor surfaces 400 yards astern, 30 seconds later. Both submarines are now on the surface inside Holy Loch in broad daylight, 30 miles from Glasgow. The Victor's bow is visibly damaged, sonar dome missing. Madison's starboard hull shows a long diagonal gouge. Topside crews scramble to open hatches and inspect the damage. The clock is now running. NATO P-3 Orion patrol aircraft orbit overhead every 30 minutes. If one arrives now, both governments lose control of the narrative. Madison topside crew opens the sail hatches and inspects the starboard hull. They see a 9-foot diagonal gouge across the outer hull plating, frames 47 to 56. The plating is buckled but not breached. No visible cracks in the missile tube fairings. The damage is limited to the outer hull. Damage control secures the outer hull space and confirms the pressure hull is holding 1 atmosphere, no leaks. The captain has his answer. The missile compartment is intact. He orders dive preparation, but he must wait for the Victor to clear the datum before diving. Collision protocol requires separation to avoid a second impact. Madison cannot dive until the Victor moves. The clock is ticking. They have been on the surface for 4 minutes. Victor topside crew reports bow damage forward of the torpedo room bulkhead. The sonar dome is crushed and missing. Flooding secured by closing the watertight door to the sonar equipment space. No water in the torpedo room. Navigation and depth control are functional. The captain has his answer. The boat can dive and transit home. Sonar is inoperative, but he can navigate by dead reckoning and surface intermittently to fix position. The captain orders crash dive. He must transit 40 miles submerged to international waters before the next sonar sweep by NATO's SOSUS array, the underwater listening network. If SOSUS detects him inside territorial waters, NATO will have acoustic proof of the violation. The Victor dive klaxon sounds. Crew scrambles below. 4 minutes, 30 seconds on the surface. NATO P-3 Orion patrol aircraft is 12 minutes out from Holy Loch on routine surveillance orbit. The P-3 carries cameras capable of photographing hull numbers and damage from 8,000 feet. If it photographs 2 surface submarines, 1 Soviet, 1 US missile boat, inside British territorial waters, CIA satellite analysis will confirm the Soviet territorial violation within 24 hours. The photographs will reach the White House and the Kremlin within 48 hours. Both governments will face immediate pressure to respond. Diplomatic protest, expulsion of naval attachés, escalation of patrol activity. Neither side wants that outcome, but neither side can control it once the photographs exist. The clock is now at 6 minutes. Victor is diving. Madison waits 90 seconds to ensure separation. At 6 minutes on the surface, Madison's dive klaxon sounds. Bow ballast tanks flood. The submarine pitches down 15 degrees and submerges. Madison reaches 150 feet depth and levels off. The captain orders slow-speed transit to open ocean, maintaining depth 200 feet until clear of the Firth of Clyde. Madison will surface again 20 miles offshore for full hull inspection by a Drydock tender. The collision is over. Both submarines are submerged. Both are damaged, but operational. Both captains know they have avoided the worst outcome. A photograph of 2 nuclear-armed submarines surfaced together inside a NATO base after a collision. That photograph would have forced both governments to explain the unexplainable. Instead, the incident remains invisible. For now. K-306 transits submerged at 40 meters depth, heading northwest toward the North Atlantic and international waters. The captain orders silent running, minimum machinery noise to avoid detection by SOSUS. Navigation is by dead reckoning and inertial guidance. No sonar, no periscope fixes until well clear of British waters. The transit will take 14 days at slow speed to reach the Northern Fleet Base at Murmansk. The captain knows he will face an investigation. Territorial violation without GRU confirmation is a serious breach of standing orders. But he also knows the alternative was losing the trail mission entirely. The mission failed anyway. Madison's acoustic signature was not recorded. The only result is a damaged submarine and a diplomatic incident waiting to happen. USS James Madison enters floating dry dock, USS Los Alamos, at Holy Loch. Full inspection reveals a 9-foot diagonal scratch across frames 47 to 56. The outer hull is buckled, but the pressure hull is intact. No missile tube damage, no warhead contamination. Repairs are completed in 7 days. Outer hull plating replaced, frames reinforced, pressure tests passed. Madison returns to deterrent patrol on November 10, 1974. The crew receives no public recognition. The collision is classified. Madison's patrol report lists the incident as minor hull contact with submerged object, cause unknown. The 16 Poseidon warheads remain aboard throughout the repair. Standard procedure: warheads are not offloaded unless tube integrity is compromised. They were not. Soviet K-306 reaches Northern Fleet Base 2 weeks after the collision. Post-action investigation concludes the captain violated standing orders prohibiting territorial penetration without GRU intelligence confirmation of target departure. The commander receives a severe reprimand and is reassigned to staff duty. The submarine enters Drydock for bow reconstruction. Hull repairs take 6 months. K306 returns to operational status in May 1975. The collision is not reported in Soviet naval publications. No crew decorations are awarded. The incident is classified and remains so until the end of the Cold War. The captain's career effectively ends. The mission failed, the submarine was damaged, and the territorial violation achieved nothing. Neither government discloses the incident. Washington worries that public disclosure will force the Royal Navy to explain how a Soviet submarine penetrated British territorial waters undetected, fueling Scottish anti-nuclear base protests that are already politically sensitive. Moscow cannot admit territorial violation without triggering a diplomatic crisis and domestic questions about naval competence. Both sides independently choose silence. There is no bilateral communication about the collision in 1974. No secure channel exists for such discussions. The U.S. Navy briefs NATO naval staff under strict classification. The Soviet Navy reports the incident to the General Staff, but recommends no public statement. Both governments arrive at the same conclusion. The collision is an operational accident, not a strategic provocation, and neither side benefits from escalation. In 2017, a CIA memo to National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger is declassified. Dated November 1974, the memo confirms the collision and notes, quote, "Both submarines surfaced, and the Soviet boat subsequently submerged again," end quote. This is the first public confirmation of the incident, 43 years later. The memo is released as part of a routine declassification review of Cold War intelligence documents. It receives minimal press coverage. Most of the operational details remain classified. The memo does not identify the Soviet submarine by hull number, does not specify the exact location, and does not describe the damage. It is a single paragraph in a 30-page briefing book. But it proves the collision happened. And it proves both governments knew. The U.S. Navy revises ballistic missile submarine departure procedures after the collision. New doctrine prohibits submerged maneuvering inside Holy Loch or other refit anchorages. All SSBNs must surface transit to the mouth of the Firth of Clyde before diving. The change eliminates the acoustic clutter problem that caused the collision. Surface transits are visible to radar and patrol aircraft, so there is no ambiguity about SSBN position. The doctrine remains in effect until Holy Loch Base closes in 1992. Similar procedures are adopted at U.S. submarine bases in Spain, Italy, and the Pacific. The change is not publicly explained, but it is directly traceable to the November 1974 incident. Madison's early dive to test the quiet propulsor created the encounter geometry. That test protocol is also revised. Propulsor tests are conducted only in open water, outside territorial limits. The Soviet Navy upgrades Victor-class passive sonar with improved clutter rejection algorithms and mandates 3-minute bearing drift confirmation before closing any contact inside 5,000 yards. The upgrade is part of a broader modernization program for the Victor II and Victor III variants, introduced in the late 1970s. The new sonar processing uses autocorrelation to detect slow-speed maneuvering contacts in harbor clutter, exactly the capability K306 lacked in 1974. The upgrade does not eliminate the risk of collision, but it reduces the probability by giving sonar operators better tools to classify stationary versus moving contacts. The 3-minute bearing drift rule is added to standing orders for all Soviet attack submarines conducting SSBN trail missions. That rule matches the constraint explained earlier. Bearing drift requires stable tracking to compute. The collision reinforces the importance of the U.S. Navy's SubSafe program, established after the loss of USS Thresher in 1963. SubSafe mandates pressure hull integrity inspections after any collision, grounding, or depth excursion. Madison's 7-day Drydock inspection followed SubSafe protocol. Visual inspection of all pressure hull welds, hydrostatic testing of missile tubes, and certification by independent inspectors before return to service. The protocol is credited with preventing warhead contamination and ensuring Madison could safely resume patrol. The collision also drives updates to bilateral collision avoidance protocols. In 1972, the US and USSR signed the Incidents at Sea Agreement to reduce the risk of accidents between naval vessels. The agreement did not cover submerged collisions inside territorial waters because neither side wanted to acknowledge such operations. After 1974, informal procedures are quietly adopted. No active sonar prosecution of unidentified submerged contacts inside refit anchorages. Holy Loch Submarine Base closes in 1992, shortly after the end of the Cold War. The base served as the primary forward refit facility for U.S. Polaris and Poseidon ballistic missile submarines from 1961 to 1992. At its peak, Holy Loch supported 6 SSBNs and provided rapid turnaround for deterrent patrols. The 1974 collision was one of several incidents that highlighted the vulnerability of forward bases to Soviet surveillance. After the Cold War, the strategic calculus changed. Trident submarines had longer patrol endurance and no longer required forward basing. Holy Loch was decommissioned and the facilities returned to civilian use. USS Canopus, the submarine tender that supported Madison, was decommissioned in 1994. Madison itself was decommissioned in 1992 after 25 years of service. The submarine was scrapped under the Nuclear-Powered Ship and Submarine Recycling Program. The November 1974 collision was not the only submarine incident during the Cold War, but it was the only known collision between a Soviet attack submarine and a U.S. ballistic missile submarine inside a NATO base. Other collisions occurred in open ocean. USS Tullybee and a Soviet Echo-class in 1970, HMS Warspite and a Soviet submarine in the Barents Sea in 1968. The risk of submerged collision remains today. Modern submarines are quieter, passive sonar is more capable, but the fundamental constraint has not changed. Passive sonar cannot reliably detect and classify slow-speed maneuvering contacts in acoustically cluttered environments. The doctrinal changes after 1974, surface transits from refit bases, bearing drift confirmation rules, reduce the probability, but they do not eliminate the risk. The collision also proved a larger point about Cold War stability. Both governments chose operational silence over strategic advantage when nuclear weapons were at risk. Washington could have used the incident to prove Soviet territorial violations and demand international condemnation. Moscow could have used it to highlight the dangers of U.S. forward basing and fuel anti-nuclear protests in Scotland. Neither side did. The reason? Both governments understood that publicizing a nuclear-armed collision inside a NATO base would force escalation neither wanted. The collision proved that even in the Cold War, when submarines armed with hundreds of nuclear warheads operated in the same confined waters, both superpowers valued stability over propaganda. The story remained buried for 43 years. It is a reminder that some of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War were the ones that never made the news.